Thank you, James. Hi, everyone. I'm conscious that we don't have that much time left. Just a brief overview for those of you that weren't here at the beginning of the symposium, and also to explain where the consensus project comes in within the know-how. So it was explained at the beginning, if you look at the know-how model, the idea is to build an entire approach to weight loss maintenance across Europe, starting with evidence foundation, and we had 2 presentations about that. Going to building a toolkit that can be used digitally to have a higher level of reach and uptake, and then test this toolkit, and then finally share these results with different kinds of stakeholders, with potentially commercial companies, with other researchers, etc. And within this level of thinking of how we can share and disseminate and be able to make the know-how a useful project in the long term for different stakeholders across Europe, there was the idea of developing this consensus project and this consensus approach. And I'm going to talk about this work in progress. And at the end, we'll have a few minutes where I will launch a discussion and also have your views of what you think that can be useful within this consensus. So how did this idea started? We do not have an international level consensus of what to do when it comes to weight loss maintenance. And for those of you that are practitioners or those of you that are researchers, you know that still the definition between what is weight loss maintenance, what are the differences in terms of practices, what are the differences in terms of strategies that we discussed today is still in its beginnings. We're still doing research, we're still having this debate, and when you look at the guidelines, there is still vague and very few information about it. So doing the research in know-how and with all the experts that we have involved in this consortium, we realized that there was a need to have a more international level consensus. We are aware that some countries like the UK have gone a long way on doing this. Other countries like Portugal have very few guidelines when it comes to weight loss maintenance. At the same time, if you want to establish evidence-based practices for effective interventions, we also have to consider that we still have gaps and implementation barriers, and this is also linked with a lack of knowledge and a lack of good information that we can use then based on to develop our work when it comes to sustained weight management. Again, we don't know what providers do across Europe in terms of weight loss maintenance, what are the differences, what is the support, and if we don't have this kind of consensus, it's really hard to have a systematized way of doing practice, and this also has an implication in terms of research, because if practice is not systematized internationally, then we don't have a good basis to do research, see what it works, and how we can improve services. So both things are very linked. Another important aspect is the recent shift in terms of research and policy of considering obesity as part of a whole complex system approach. So thinking about the individual, the communities, the families, the organizations where we are, and the collaborations and how this has links in terms of communication and in terms of the treatments that are put in practice. So there has been this shift of thinking how we can work together and think of the individual within a complex system. If we think of a complex system or a whole system approach, it also brings a lot of complexities in terms of how can we integrate evidence-based research into the systems when a lot of our research has a clear separation between focusing on the individual and behavior change and focusing on what is the environment and other policies. And this is something that has been discussed during this conference, sorry. So the main aim of this project is to develop an expert consensus-based set of priorities and recommendations for long-term weight management practices. So the entire purpose is to think of what are the challenges and priorities in terms of research, but also in terms of practice. And from the evidence that we have so far, what can we recommend when we bring together different experts with different backgrounds? What can we recommend in terms of long-term weight management practices? And what we don't know so far and we cannot recommend. So to achieve this, step one will be to develop a survey exploring the provider's views, challenges, and strategies that are used to weight loss maintenance. And I will tell who these stakeholders are. And then in step two, we are going to use the information from the study and develop a Delphi process in which we are going to use the key themes identified in step one and then we are going to build this consensus exercise. So the target population are key stakeholders involved in obesity management. So this can be practitioners, specialists, and other specialist commissioners, public health, anyone that is involved in sustained weight management treatments, and also considering what is the role of the individuals and the patients in themselves. And we are still thinking of how the survey can address these different stakeholders. The survey is delivered with the support of EASO, and it's going to be delivered online using Qualtrics, so very common online platform that I'm sure most of you know. And it's going to have an initial pilot to test how comprehensive, how coherent it is, if it is well accepted, and its duration. The main aim, as I mentioned before, is to understand exactly what we need consensus on. So what are the key points that we need to have international guidance, international recommendations to provide better weight management practices in the long term, and think about the strategies associated with that. So you can see in the slide just some examples of questions that we are building, such as what is the distinction between weight loss maintenance, and weight regain prevention? Does this make a difference in the way that you use it in practice, the strategies that are used? Do the services where you currently work have any guidance on how to deal with different patients that come at different stages? What are the enablers and the barriers to weight loss promotion? And what is the support to also implement evidence-based practice? And as I said before, focusing on a whole system approach. We are also considering and currently thinking how we can use behavior change frameworks to inform the survey. So one of the purposes in NoHoW is to bring behavior change research in terms of theories and techniques and knowledge, and bring this to promoting sustained weight management. And thinking about the survey and thinking about this whole complex system approach, using behavior change frameworks can be very useful. And here you see an example of the behavior change wheel, which is one of the most widely used behavior change frameworks. And the basic idea, we don't have time to go through all of this, but the basic idea is that we need to consider the sources of behavior, so what you see in the green part of this wheel, and the sources of behavior are the determinants that have to do with individual in terms of motivation and capability that you heard earlier today, but also the opportunity. And these determinants of behavior have influences on both the practitioners, both the commissioners, the patients, the public health specialists. All of these stakeholders have different sources of behavior that have an impact on the way that they daily deal and the guidelines that are built in terms of weight management and weight loss maintenance. And we need to capture these determinants for these different stakeholders. And then if you look at the outer side of the wheel, you see intervention functions. And what this is saying is that the way that we provide recommendations and the way that we choose what are the strategies that we are using in our interventions, in our treatments, comes from the sources. So if we don't identify exactly what are the sources of behavior, we don't know which interventions and which techniques or strategies are useful to impact on the stakeholders who in turn will improve their practices when they are developing guidelines and treatments for obesity. And then here in the gray part of the wheel, you can see the policy categories. So these are all the regulations and everything that is in place in the organizations and in this complex system that will have an influence on how far we can go with the recommendations. So if we don't assess what is going on in different countries, in different regions, in terms of the guidance and the practices that are in place for obesity and weight management treatments, we cannot put in practice the rest of the wheel. So one of the purposes of the survey is to try to analyze and try to get to the bottom of all of these areas and all of these parts of the wheel that have an impact, and then build a consensus based on this. So step 2, the expert consensus procedure, as I said before, derives from the survey and from this analysis that we are going to do with the survey, and it has 3 rounds, so it's a typical Delphi procedure. In round 1, we are going to ask open-ended questions based on the survey to have a broader understanding on the experts' views. So these open-ended questions are based on their survey, but they still allow the experts to provide more input in terms of what is happening on weight loss maintenance treatment. Then we use these responses, we conduct a meta-analysis, and from this, we develop course statements. So these course statements are recommendations, are statements related with what are the strategies that can be used, what are the limitations on research, what are the key aspects in terms of treatment. And then, and then in round 2, we ask them to rate their agreement with the statements. So we use Likert scales, and we just present the statements and ask stakeholders to say if they agree on a 5-point Likert scale with the statements presented. And from this, we have an inter-rater agreement that is going to be established using formal consensus agreements. And then in the Delphi procedure, what is done is we use the answers from round 2. So we use the average of those answers, and we present again to the stakeholders. So we present the statements, and we say in the previous round, this number of stakeholders answer, or this was the average answer for statement A. Would you like to keep your answer? How would you rate it now? And then we present the rating again, and you can either choose the same or you can choose a higher or lower number. And the idea is to see also what are the influences based on rethinking about the statement again and knowing what the other stakeholders actually replied. We haven't yet decided how this is going to be presented to different stakeholders. As I said, this is work in progress at the moment. So the way we thought of finishing this talk about the consensus is actually to get your views about aspects that you think are really relevant and should be in this exercise. So as I said at the beginning, the idea of the consensus exercise that we can involve all of you and all the experts in Europe that work with weight management in building something that is useful. So we have here 2 major questions. You may want to comment on these questions or ask anything else or related with this. What is quite relevant is to understand how these services look like in your country. So what is done in terms of weight loss maintenance? Is there a distinction between weight loss and weight loss maintenance, and how this reflects? And what are your experiences with working with other practitioners and commissioners in promoting weight loss maintenance? And of course, you don't need to answer this now. You can get in touch with us, send your ideas by email, follow us on Twitter. We'll be asking all of this, that. But I open the floor for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marta, for laying out this very clear to everyone. Some questions or comments from the audience? Please go ahead, state your name and where you're from, please.
Thank you, Marta. My name is Sven Schubert. I'm an EASO Patient Council member from Ireland. Thanks for your presentation. It's really interesting. I'm post-bariatric surgery myself, so weight loss maintenance and weight gain prevention or management is an issue for me personally, so it's very close to my heart. I'm wondering, because the current focus, so weight loss management seems to be in its infancy. We're just about out there with making surgery an acceptable treatment to the payers. So they're much more reluctant to value weight loss management. I was wondering, is there a connection, and is it feasible to exploit the connection to prevention? Because a lot of the measures you would apply to prevent obesity will be helpful to manage weight loss and maintain weight loss, and like obesogenic environments, etc. So is this part of your study? Are you interacting with the preventers?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Do you want to, James?
I think we both probably contribute to that answer. One thing that's, I think there are now a good handful of big prospective weight loss maintenance data sets, whether they're either observational or there's been an intervention. I think the concept of weight loss maintenance per se is tricky. And it reflects more the goals of the investigator rather than the participant. Many participants who engage in these studies do not want to maintain their weight, they want to lose more weight. I think it might be helpful as part of our consensus, if we agree that a common focus is the prevention of weight gain and regain, rather than this concept of weight loss maintenance. The only data set we really saw, and I've ever seen, where you've got people who are absolute weight loss maintainers, are people who've achieved what they state is their goal target weight. It's not the National Weight Control Registry, and it's not a number of data sets that we commonly call weight loss maintenance data sets.
Again, a question for the entire group. It's Sean Wharton from Toronto. When we're looking at weight loss maintenance, we're looking at the small subset of people trying to lose weight and keep it off over the long term. So, and when Rena Wing and James Hill looked at the National Control Registry and the people that lost weight, looking at all the analysis of what they did to lose weight, and you try to apply those principles to people who are trying to lose weight, it doesn't really work. So what people are doing to maintain the weight doesn't necessarily translate to help the people who are trying to also get there. They'd like to be on that ship, and they're trying to use the same methods that the people who are on that ship losing weight are using, but they don't get to that goal because of other reasons, physiology reasons and other types of mechanisms. So those behavior modifications do not work for them. So is there any thought of where this is going to go in terms of your analysis? If these people were able to maintain their weight loss because of these methods, now what do we do with that information?
I think Liz is the best person to answer that based on the results from the first NoHoW studies.
Okay, thank you for your question. I think the National Weight Control Registry is a very interesting population. They're very self-selecting. They're not typical of the general population. They're people who not only lost weight and kept it off, but went to the trouble of joining a registry specifically around maintenance. As such, I don't think it's particularly surprising that when you try and apply some of the strategies that they've identified on a general population level, or just ordinary folks try and use them, they're not always that helpful. We have a paper under review at the moment that looks at what people in the real world, who we have approached to talk about weight, are doing to try and maintain. And what we've seen is many people do not have a maintenance concept. You have the sprint, you have the exciting weight loss where actually, if you're lucky, it's hard work, but you get to the weight loss, and then you have the arduous marathon, which is the rest of your life to keep the weight loss. And we don't even have a commonly used phrase, we don't have terminology to communicate with the public about what maintenance is and what it really means. As such, it shouldn't be surprising that the public struggle to understand evidence-based weight loss, but in terms of maintenance, we can't even start the conversation when there's no concept, no concrete shared understanding. So I think I've deviated slightly from your question, but in terms of why these techniques don't seem to be generalizable, I think I can speak very easily to that, and that's that the general population is several steps behind the individuals involved in the National Weight Control Registry, and also the average person, when they lose weight, they're quite glad to have finished doing all the difficult things, and they don't necessarily want to engage with additional things to keep it off for all that time. So there's a motivational barrier, there's a knowledge barrier, and there's also a research barrier in terms of effective strategies. And I think all of those speak to the effect that you're talking about there. Does that contribute to answering your question? Okay.
It's also just pointing out, because you mentioned the issue of physiology. It's very interesting that there is a lot of big physiology that speaks to weight regain and may even drive weight regain, particularly at large amounts of weight that are lost. So even if you go back to the Second World War literature, people, who, regardless of how overweight they were or not, who have lost 25% plus of their weight, start showing big physiological adaptations in terms of structure, function, and behavior. But when we're talking about therapeutic weight loss in the general population, we're really in the 0 to 10% zone. And so I think what we're talking about is we need a better understanding of what we and they are aiming for, and we need a better understanding of the way physiology and behavior interact in that zone in a wider proportion of the general population.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep. Mike?
Thank you. Just to reflect a little more on that, I was wondering if we're not on the path of doing the same mistake we did with obesity, is putting everybody in the same box, like weight loss maintainers, because there are probably many different types of weight loss maintainers. There are those of the National Weight Control Registry, and there are all these patterns of people who apply. For now, they're looking for themselves for the right strategies, but you have those who practice a lot of physical activity and regulate their weight like that, and others who will be on a restraint, loss of control pattern, et cetera, And I think we really need to define better these various patterns in the population. There are those who are subject to metabolism modifications, but it's not the rule. There are many people who have just a normal metabolism even after weight loss. So I think it's difficult to try to define just one big model, because there are so many different groups of people with weight loss maintenance.
Yeah. I was just going to say, I think that's the beauty in NoHoW,
Yeah.
is that we're not going to solve the entire problem, but it's an amazing step to start looking exactly at that. So I think that NoHoW starts with the premise that there aren't just one type of weight loss maintainers. I think that's kind of the basic idea. And there aren't just one type of factors, there are many factors, there are many interacting factors, and there are many things going on. And what we are looking, and James presented that a bit at the beginning, we're thinking of this idea of getting to a personalized approach in the future. And what we are assessing in NoHoW in terms of looking at different emotional regulation aspects, different self-regulation, behavioral aspects, different motivational aspects, having data on physiological parameters, having data on physical activity, on their dietary habits, all of that will allow us to start drawing that picture of what are the different types of people that we have when we talk about long-term weight management, and also considering that there might not be a type of people, but people that have different factors going on at different stages of the weight management process. But with this kind of data, you can actually look at that. And I just put this slide, because this is a bit of an idea of when we think about that, is exactly identifying what are these factors that you see on green. What is it going on in terms of the individual? What are the different aspects that will then allow us to be able to understand how to intervene with these different individuals?
I think we need to think about the type of models we're using. We are not going to have models where you can pigeonhole groups of people where specific factors explain large proportions of the variance. It doesn't work that way. You get lots of factors explaining very small proportions of the variance. And when you try and zoom in on those factors, as people do in a reductionist way, they fragment into even smaller factors that explain less of the variance. So what we need to do is where we're talking about moderation and mediation analyses, is trying to articulate how those factors relate to each other, the interventions that we're using, and the populations in which we're using. And you can do it above the skin in terms of psychology and behavior, and you can do it below the skin in terms of physiological resistance to weight loss. The big picture is, can we ever join those two domains together? What happens under the skin during dynamic changes in energy balance speak to behavior through changes in physiological signaling and function.
And on that note, on the complexity of all this, I'd like to close this symposium. Thank those of you who are still here for being here over time. I didn't want to stop the discussion because I thought it was so good. But thank you very much, and thank you to the speakers for presenting so excellently.